power market in Mogadishu.
NATO's military success against
many Western nations.
This is on assignment.
Welcome to the show, everybody. Stay with us as we get the inside stories from our VOA colleagues around the world. I'm Alex Villarreal.
And I'm Imran Siddiqui. First up, we're off to Africa to look at some solutions for the continent's many power problems.
American farmers applaud the thawing of U.S.-Cuba relations and what it might mean for them.
He's been called the musician of the Syrian revolution. VOA profiles the acclaimed pianist and composer.
And Francis Alonso, you do what? We spend a day with VOA Radio News.
This and more coming your way right now as we take you on assignment. Power outages are a fact of life across much of Africa, with nearly daily blackouts affecting rich and poor countries. Frustrating to say the least.
And it's something VOA East Africa correspondent Gabe Joslow knows about firsthand, and he's also done reports on the challenges of generating and supplying electricity across the continent. Here's his look at the problem's many effects.
A small business in Nairobi that began as a party supply outfit has expanded to serve restaurants and supermarkets, moving more than a ton of ice a day, while their custom-made ice sculptures decorate State House events. It's an entrepreneurial success story, but Betty Mbite, office manager of the Iceman Company, says the limits of the country's power supply puts the business in jeopardy.
Sometime last year when we had about 3 days without power and we couldn't operate at all. Yes, because the machines need power, the cold room needs power, and no one can go on without any power.
Gabe, you did an interesting story about how these power outages have been affecting businesses. Now, how often is this happening?
I'd say our power goes out pretty much every day. It's not always for a very long period of time, but you can count on it going out usually in the mornings for just blinking out. And you know, this is a problem that a lot of people are facing.
To keep their swans cold and to keep their customers happy, the Iceman needs a 24-hour supply of power. But relying on Kenya's grid is proving costly, says Mbite.
It is a difficult business, especially if the power is high, because everything you make goes to the power. Yes, we pay back to the government for power.
The number one cost for this business is power. No power, no ice. But the problem in Kenya and across much of Africa is that power is often inaccessible, expensive, and inconsistent.
In Kenya, they're working on ways to increase power generation so that there's just more power available for this growing population. At the same time, they have to invest in making the power lines and all of that sort of delivery infrastructure also much stronger to take the new load of power that's being created.
Some 600 million Africans have no access to electricity at all. That's 60% of the population. Africa consumes less power than any other region in the world, but pays nearly the same average tariffs as the United States and about twice as much as East Asia.
Now, what's being done then? You know, you mentioned some of these strategies. What are governments doing to try to fix this?
Well, there's some interesting initiatives out there. There's everybody wants to address this problem because you know, without power, you have a lot of lost economic potential. So it's not like there's no goodwill here. One of the interesting initiatives that's being developed was actually announced at the World Economic Forum in Davos last month.
African Development Bank President Donald Kaberuka said energy shortages are holding countries back.
At this moment, every single African country is experiencing energy shortages and power outages. That is costing the continent 2% of the GDP. In fact, an African leader says that we're a continent of miracles. If we're growing at 5% without enough electricity, think of what we could do if we had enough electricity.
This is a group, African Energy Leaders Group, which is forming to unite politicians, business leaders, as well as investors to try to come up with strategies to encourage more investment, to encourage better government policies that will make it easier for investment, with the overall aim of just increasing power and making it reach consumers much easier. One of the things that they have discussed is that one country can't really do it all on their own.
It is not possible for our individual 54 countries to have energy security from their own domestic resources. We have to create viable regional markets for power, and that is possible.
What you're going to see in Africa is a lot of regional effort, so that, for instance, there'll be like a West African power bank where a power generator in Cameroon, for instance, would share its energy capacity with neighboring countries, like we would go to Niger or go to Nigeria. So this is the kind of initiative that I think we will be seeing more in coming years, and it'll be really pan-African in that sense.
All right, thanks to Gabe, our East Africa correspondent based in Nairobi.
We're taking a break now. On the other side, the new U.S.-Cuba relationship and what it means for American farmers. You're watching On Assignment. Polls show some 60% of Americans support President Obama's decision to restore diplomatic relations with Cuba and move toward ending the embargo in place since the 1960s. Among the strongest supporters for ending it are American farmers who see Cuba as a new market for their exports. VOA's Midwest correspondent Kane Farabah has been looking at the story as it affects farmers in Illinois and joins me right now. Thank you so much for joining me, Kane.
Thank you, Imran.
Kane, you spent a lot of time with this particular farmer. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, Thomas Martin is a farmer near Wagoner, Illinois. He's been farming on land that has been in his family for 3 or 4 generations. He's someone who is very connected to his land, and he is someone who's an advocate of exploring new markets for U.S. agricultural products. And a new market for U.S. agricultural products, at least a new expanded market, would be Cuba. And so ending the embargo and having more trade with Cuba is something that he completely supports.
You also mentioned in your report that in the past, U.S. farmers could sell to Cuba, but the transaction was strictly cash, which put them at a disadvantage. How so?
Well, what has happened is that the United States, because of the embargo, is not able to extend credit to Cuba. So everything that is exported there, particularly the corn and the soy that's coming from the Midwest United States here, it has to be paid for in cash up front. You know, there are certain technicalities that help that effort. But what that has made is it's made the U.S. less competitive with countries like Brazil, which are exporting to Cuba and are establishing credit with Cuba. So that has actually resulted in a decline of several $100 million worth of exports to Cuba in the last 5 or 6 years.
And there's a group of representatives that'll be visiting Cuba. Thomas Martin is one of them. Is he excited about this?
He's very excited. He's been to Cuba before, and he's excited to go again because he's going to take a learning journey tour with the group. It's going with the U.S. Agricultural Coalition for Cuba, which is a coalition of groups that represent producers, agricultural firms here in the Midwest, and they're going on a tour really to explore what could happen in Cuba if there wasn't an embargo and where they could place their products.
All right. There's also the question of human rights in Cuba and how the U.S. and Cuba will reconcile this issue. Thomas Martin had a comment in your report about that. Let's roll that clip and come back.
As both a farmer and a Catholic, you know, I definitely saw that there's a lot of churches closed there, and that's something that definitely concerns me in Cuba is their human rights record. That said, 54 years of our embargo has done very, very little as far as improving the human rights conditions in Cuba.
Listen to the soundbite. It seems like as if opening up or removing these sanctions would kind of work in the favor of the Cuban regime.
Well, I think that President Obama, in his State of the Union address, addressed this concern directly, and he said that it's time for something new. It's time for a new approach. I think Thomas Martin, in his comment there, it indicated that isolating the Cuban regime from the United States has been the tactic in place for the last 54 years. There hasn't been a dramatic change in the human rights record of Cuba, and so I think that Thomas Martin and others who are advocating for an end to the embargo hope that by opening Cuba up to the United States may help influence or change that human rights record.
All right, we'll keep an eye on that. VOA Midwest correspondent Kane Farabah, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Imran.
Moving on, we're taking another break. When we return, more about the man called the musician of the Syrian Revolution. You're watching On Assignment. He's been called the musician of the Syrian Revolution. Malik Jandali, an acclaimed pianist and composer who grew up in Syria and now lives in New York. Recently debuted some of his newest work at Carnegie Hall.
Yes, he did. And Jandali's work, a blend of classical and Middle Eastern music, is dedicated to his homeland and to those who have resisted the government of Bashar al-Assad or been killed by it. As VOA's Carolyn Weaver tells me from New York, Jandali brings an artist's passion to his compositions for Syria. Carolyn, tell us, you did this, this very fascinating piece. Who is Malik Jandali?
He is kind of like a composer and a pianist in a movie, almost. He's a little dictatorial, he's so passionate, but he's very charming and humble at the same time. He was born in Germany, but grew up in Homs, Syria, and has since become a U.S. citizen. He came here for his education in his early 20s.
And you had the chance to meet him and spend some time with him as you did this story on him. What was that like?
Well, he's a very charming, a very sincere artist, I would say, who is completely absorbed in the cause of the Syrian revolution.
It is their music. I'm inspired by their courageous acts, by their memories, by their history.
He's trying to raise awareness about what's happening in Syria using his music. And he also said with one of his most recent works, the Syrian Symphony, he wants to leave behind something for people in 100 years that will kind of memorialize the trauma that they are going through now.
Let's talk about how Malik originally became interested in composing Middle Eastern music.
Well, he learned that about 40 miles from his home city, there was an ancient civilization in Syria called Ugarit that had devised the oldest known form of musical notation, which was discovered on clay tablets in this city.
So what I'm trying to do is to preserve and present my culture that is being destroyed today.
And one of his first songs incorporating Middle Eastern modes into Western structures was based on that song, which was a song to the moon goddess of the time.
Each one is a story. Story of beautiful counterpoint between the call of prayer from a minaret and the church bells in Damascus, or a child's cry in Homs.
And how does he incorporate this traditional Arabic instrument, the oud, in his music?
Recently, he performed at Carnegie Hall with his chamber trio. He played the piano. He had a wonderful cellist, Laura Metcalf, and a wonderful oud player, Abdul Rahim Al-Siyadi. They performed works that were that combined the oud with the piano and the cello, which is something that really hasn't been done much before. Performed it outside the White House in Lafayette Park in July 2011. And you would think that a song called I Am My Homeland wouldn't offend anybody, but that was kind of a cry for the revolution and for freedom and democracy and independence from the dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad. A couple of days later, he says that Syrian security forces broke into his parents' home in Homs, Syria, and beat them up. And he had them taken to the United States or removed to the United States after that. It really felt like a privilege to be able to shoot his rehearsal with his chamber trio. The music was so beautiful, and to watch them all interacting with each other, the oud player with the cellist and both of them with Malik was wonderful.
You know, an interesting thing to note about John Dolly, he told Carolyn that some may question why he's composed music for Syrians when they are in such dire need of physical help, you know. But he says he wants people 100 years from now to know that the Syrian plight was also immortalized in music. So he views it as an important contribution he's making.
All right. Moving on, there are a lot of different people working at the Voice of America, and we've been telling you about some of the people behind the microphones here at VOA. One of them is Frances Alonso, an English radio newscaster and women's issues reporter.
Yes, and Frances is the next subject in our ongoing series, You Do What? Check it out.
From Washington, this is VOA News. I'm Frances Alonso reporting. Ukraine's military says,
as a newscaster, I cover the day's top news events. It could be President Obama overseas.
This is an important step that shows how we can work together to elevate our relationship.
Right now, the Ukraine crisis is top news.
It comes despite a four-nation ceasefire deal.
I come in and make sure that we get the top stories of the day so that our listeners are fully informed about what's going on.
Ukraine's military says 8 soldiers have been killed and 34 wounded in fighting in eastern Ukraine in the past day.
For women's issues, I also cover topics that you don't really like to talk about, like FGM, the female genital mutilation.
How is this a prosecutable crime if more than likely these young ladies don't have a regular gynecological exam?
Frontline professionals not only need to be aware of what's
What I
going
like
on,
about covering these hard subjects is that it gives the listener an idea of what other women around the world are going through.
So now what have you learned about your own leadership skills?
A lot of the issues that women have are universal. It could be women's economic empowerment, child marriage, which can range from countries in Africa to Asia. A lot of these topics are very hard to listen to.
any type of FGM is a human rights abuse.
It's important to get the women's voices there. A lot of my stories come from word of mouth, Twitter, social media. I feel my job is really important in the sense that it creates solidarity, and it's really important for me to let women know around the world that they aren't alone, that they don't have to go through this by themselves, that there are other women that are speaking out and not afraid to.
Just you and I and the little people who, might be the voices that are that tipping point.
It empowers women just to know that other women are also experiencing this.
I'm Frances Alonso, newscaster and women's issues journalist at the Voice of America.
And now to the story of another enterprising woman who is enjoying a fulfilling career as a home builder and an artist.
VOA's Julie Tabo caught up with Krista Wolf to find out how she has prospered in the male-dominated construction business as she combines two very different disciplines. Take a look.
Krista Wolf became interested in art at a very early age.
My parents died when I was young, and I lived with a lot of different relatives, but I lived primarily with one relative who came from an amazing family of artists.
Those artists painted frescoes in churches and homes in Greece, a tradition that continued when two of her uncles emigrated to America.
They would do churches and do paintings in churches, and then on top of it they did construction, which was their way of making money because nobody was really paying for frescoes in America. I was in awe of it. I wanted to go to work with them whenever I could.
That early exposure paid off. Today, Wolf is a professional artist who draws inspiration from the world around her.
The balls in the air are how many balls we have going in the air.
Whether it's women juggling family and career or an industrious osprey.
I watched him guard his family. He comes every year. He builds this incredible nest. He's a builder. So we're pretty much gutting this house. This is a typical renovation.
And, like her immigrant family and the osprey that nests near her studio, Wolf is also a home builder.
as long as I can remember, I loved building things. So when I wasn't painting, I was building things.
When is that wall going to get fixed over there where they cut the wire?
But becoming a professional in the male-dominated construction industry was not easy. She recalls an especially memorable occasion.
Pretty sure I was going to get a job. I was very excited about it. I had done all these sketches and drawings for this couple, and I thought, surely they're going to hire me. And the drawings were beautiful, and the woman loved everything. And as I was leaving their house, I was like, oh, this is really good. They really loved everything, and I really, really worked hard on it. I heard her husband say, there's no way in hell we're going to hire a woman to do our house. So I just kind of knew that was that.
Today, she has a thriving construction business, building award-winning properties for wealthy homeowners in the Washington, D.C. area.
Look at the designs, if you notice that they run through, and it's an interesting art form.
Incorporating her signature artistic touches throughout. And while Wolf says women in male-dominated professions still have to work longer and harder to be successful, she is optimistic about the future.
I would love to see more women, young women, do what I'm doing, because I love what I do. It has brought me such joy, and I have been greatly blessed to be able to have a career doing what I love and what I'm passionate about.
Julie Tabo, VOA News, Washington.
You know, it's really great to get introduced to someone who, like she said, is able to do what she loves and what she's passionate about. I mean, that's the pursuit of so many people.
Yeah, and it's amazing if you can do two good things that you're good at together.
Exactly.
Amazing.
Two birds with one stone, right?
Yeah, but the sad part is that we gotta go.
Yeah, that is sad.
It's time for us to get out of here, but please be sure that you tune in next week again for a special edition of On Assignment in honor of Black History Month.
Yes, and we are very excited about this show. We're going to have some amazing interviews for you, including one with a gentleman who is now in his late 90s, and more than 70 years ago, he was the star of a Broadway musical.
Can't wait for that story next week. Thank you so much for watching. On behalf of everyone on Assignment, so long from Washington.